ACLS/NTFS permissions isn't supported via the Azure portal. Custom roles can support different combinations of the same permissions provided by the built-in roles. Use the Storage Account Access Key. To access file data with the Storage Account Access Key, you must have an Azure role assigned to you that includes the Azure Back Action Microsoft.storage/storage-account/list-keys/action. This Azure role may be a built-in role or a custom role. Built-in roles that support Microsoft.storage/storage-account/list-keys/action include the following, listed in order from least to greatest permissions. The Reader and Data Access role, the Storage Account Contributor role, the Azure Resource Manager Contributor role, the Azure Resource Manager Owner role. When you attempt to access file data in the Azure portal, the portal first checks whether you've been assigned a role with Microsoft.storage/storage-account/list-keys/action. If you've been assigned a role with this action, then the portal uses the Storage Account Key for accessing file data. If you haven't been assigned a role with this action, then the portal attempts to access data using your Microsoft Entra account. When a storage account is locked with an Azure Resource Manager read-only lock, the list keys operation isn't permitted for that storage account. List keys is a post operation, and all post operations are prevented when a read-only lock is configured for the account. For this reason, when the account is locked with a read-only lock, users must use Microsoft Entra credentials to access file data in the portal. The classic subscription administrator roles, service administrator and co-administrator, include the equivalent of the Azure Resource Manager owner role. The owner role includes all actions, including the Microsoft.storage/storage-account/list-keys/action. So a user with one of these administrative roles can also access file data with the storage account key. Specify how to authorize operations on a specific file share. You can change the authentication method for individual file shares. By default, the portal uses the current authentication method. To determine the current authentication method, follow these steps. Navigate to your storage account in the Azure portal and select Data Storage greater than File Shares from the left navigation. Select a file share. Select Browse. The authentication method indicates whether you're currently using the Storage Account Access Key or your Microsoft Entra account to authenticate and authorize file share operations. If you're currently authenticating using the Storage Account Access Key, you'll see Access Key specified as the authentication method, as in the following image. If you're authenticating using your Microsoft Entra account, you'll see Microsoft Entra user account specified instead. Authenticate with your Microsoft Entra account. To switch to using your Microsoft Entra account, select the link highlighted in the image that says Switch to Microsoft Entra user account. If you have the appropriate permissions via the Azure roles that are assigned to you, you'll be able to proceed. However, if you lack the necessary permissions, you'll see an error message that you don't have permissions to list the data using your user account with Microsoft Entra ID. 2 additional RBAC permissions are required to use your Microsoft Entra account. Microsoft.storage/storage-account/file services/read file backup semantics/action. Microsoft.storage/storage-account/file services/write file backup semantics/action. No file shares will appear in the list if your Microsoft Entra account lacks permissions to view them. Authenticate with the Storage Account Access Key. To switch to using the Account Access Key, select the link that says Switch to Access Key. If you have access to the storage account key, then you'll be able to proceed. However, if you lack access to the account key, you'll see an error message that you don't have permissions to use the access key to list data. No file shares appear in the list if you don't have access to the storage account access key. Default to Microsoft Entra authorization in the Azure portal. When you create a new storage account, you can specify that the Azure portal will default to authorization with Microsoft Entra ID when a user navigates to file data. You can also configure this setting for an existing storage account. This setting specifies the default authorization method only. Keep in mind that a user can override this setting and choose to authorize data access with the storage account key. To specify that the portal will use Microsoft Entra authorization by default for data access when you create a storage account, follow these steps. Create a new storage account, following the instructions in Create a Storage Account. On the Advanced tab, in the Security section, check the box next to Default to Microsoft Entra authorization in the Azure portal. Select Review plus Create to run validation and create the storage account. To update this setting for an existing storage account, follow these steps. Navigate to the Storage Account Overview in the Azure portal. Under Settings, select Configuration. Set Default to Microsoft Entra authorization in the Azure portal to Enabled. Next unit, select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure tables. Continue. Select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure tables. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. Azure Storage supports using Microsoft Entra ID to authorize requests to table data. With Microsoft Entra ID, You can use Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC, to grant permissions to a security principal, which may be a user, group, or application service principal. The security principal is authenticated by Microsoft Entra ID to return an OAuth 2.0 token. The token can then be used to authorize a request against the table service. Authorizing requests against Azure Storage with Microsoft Entra ID provides superior security and ease of use over shared key authorization. Microsoft recommends using Microsoft Entra authorization with your table applications when possible to assure access with minimum required privileges. Authorization with Microsoft Entra ID is available for all general purpose and all public regions and national clouds. Only storage accounts created with the Azure Resource Manager deployment model support Microsoft Entra authorization. Overview of Microsoft Entra ID for tables. When a security principal, a user, group, or application attempts to access a table resource, the request must be authorized. With Microsoft Entra ID, access to a resource is a two-step process. First, the security principal's identity is authenticated and an OAuth 2.0 token is returned. Next, the token is passed as part of a request to the table service and used by the service to authorize access to the specified resource. The authentication step requires that an application request an OAuth 2.0 access token at runtime. If an application is running from within an Azure entity such as an Azure VM, a virtual machine scale set, or an Azure Functions app, it can use a managed identity to access tables. The authorization step requires that one or more Azure roles be assigned to the security principal. Azure Storage provides Azure roles that encompass common sets of permissions for table data. The roles that are assigned to a security principal determine the permissions that principal will have. Assign Azure roles for access rights. Microsoft Entra authorizes access rights to secured resources through Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC. Azure Storage defines a set of Azure built-in roles that encompass common sets of permissions used to access table data. You can also define custom roles for access to table data. When an Azure role is assigned to a Microsoft Entra security principal, Azure grants access to those resources for that security principal. A Microsoft Entra security principal may be a user, a group, an application service principal, or a managed identity for Azure resources. Resource scope. Before you assign an Azure RBAC role to a security principal, determine the scope of access that the security principal should have. Best practices dictate that it's always best to grant only the narrowest possible scope. Azure RBAC roles defined at a broader scope are inherited by the resources beneath them. You can scope access to Azure table resources at the following levels, beginning with the narrowest scope. An individual table. At this scope, a role assignment applies to the specified table. The storage account. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all tables in the account. The resource group. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the tables in all of the storage accounts in the resource group. The subscription. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the tables in all of the storage accounts in all of the resource groups in the subscription. A management group. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the tables in all of the storage accounts in all of the resource groups in all of the subscriptions in the management group. Azure built-in roles for tables. Azure RBAC provides built-in roles for authorizing access to table data using Microsoft Entra ID and OAuth. Built-in roles that provide permissions to tables in Azure Storage include Storage Table Data Contributor, used to grant read/write/delete permissions to table storage resources. Storage Table Data Reader, used to grant read-only permissions to table storage resources. Only roles explicitly defined for data access permit a security principal to access table data. Built-in roles such as owner, contributor, and storage account contributor permit a security principal to manage a storage account, but do not provide access to the table data within that account via Microsoft Entra ID. However, if a role includes Microsoft.storage/storage account/list keys/action, then a user to whom that role is assigned can access data in the storage account via shared key authorization with the account access keys. Azure role assignments may take up to 30 minutes to propagate. Next unit. Select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure queues. Continue. Select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure queues. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. When you access queue data using the Azure portal, the portal makes requests to Azure Storage under the covers. A request to Azure Storage can be authorized using either your Microsoft Entra account or the storage account access key. The portal indicates which method you are using, and enables you to switch between the two if you have the appropriate permissions. Permissions needed to access queue data. Depending on how you want to authorize access to queue data in the Azure portal, you'll need specific permissions. In most cases, these permissions are provided via Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC. Use the account access key. To access Q data with the account access key, you must have an Azure role assigned to you that includes the Azure back action Microsoft.storage/storage account/list keys/action. This Azure role may be a built-in or a custom role. Built-in roles that support Microsoft.storage/storage account/list keys/action include the following, in order from least to greatest permissions. The reader and data access role, the storage account contributor role, the Azure Resource Manager contributor role, the Azure Resource Manager owner role. When you attempted to access Q data in the Azure portal, the portal first checks whether you have been assigned a role with Microsoft.storage/storage account/list keys/action. If you have been assigned a role with this action, then the portal uses the account key for accessing Q data. If you have not been assigned a role with this action, then the portal attempts to access data using your Microsoft Entra account. Use your Microsoft Entra account to access Q data from the Azure portal using your Microsoft Entra account. Both of the following statements must be true for you. You have been assigned either a built-in or custom role that provides access to Q data. You have been assigned the Azure Resource Manager reader role, at a minimum, scope to the level of the storage account or higher. The reader role grants the most restricted permissions, but another Azure Resource Manager role that grants access to storage account management resources is also acceptable. The Azure Resource Manager reader role permits users to view storage account resources, but not modify them. It does not provide read permissions to data in Azure Storage, but only to account management resources. The reader role is necessary so that users can navigate to queues in the Azure portal. Custom roles can support different combinations of the same permissions provided by the built-in roles. Navigate to queues in the Azure portal. To view Q data in the portal, navigate to the overview for your storage account, and click on the links for queues. Alternatively, you can navigate to the queue service section in the menu. Determine the current authentication method. When you navigate to a queue, the Azure portal indicates whether you are currently using the account access key or your Microsoft Entra account to authenticate. Authenticate with the account access key. If you are authenticating using the account access key, you'll see access key specified as the authentication method in the portal. To switch to using Microsoft Entra account, click the link highlighted in the image. If you have the appropriate permissions via the Azure roles that are assigned to you, you'll be able to proceed. However, if you lack the right permissions, you'll see an error message like the following one. Notice that no queues appear in the list if your Microsoft Entra ID account lacks permissions to view them. Click on the Switch to Access Key link to use the access key for authentication again. Authenticate with your Microsoft Entra ID account. If you are authenticating using your Microsoft Entra ID account, you'll see Microsoft Entra ID user account specified as the authentication method in the portal. Default to Microsoft Entra ID authorization in the Azure portal. When you create a new storage account, you can specify that the Azure portal will default to authorization with Microsoft Entra ID when a user navigates to Q data. You can also configure this setting for an existing storage account. This setting specifies the default authorization method only, so keep in mind that a user can override this setting and choose to authorize data access with the account key. To specify that the portal will use Microsoft Entra ID authorization by default for data access when you create a storage account, follow these steps. Create a new storage account, following the instructions in Create a Storage Account. On the Advanced tab, in the Security section, check the box next to Default to Microsoft Entra ID authorization in the Azure portal. Select the Review plus Create button to run validation and create the account. To update this setting for an existing storage account, follow these steps. Navigate to the Account Overview in the Azure portal. Under Settings, select Configuration. Set Default to Microsoft Entra authorization in the Azure portal to Enabled. Next unit, select and configure appropriate methods for protecting against data security threats, including soft delete, backups, versioning, and immutable storage. Continue. Select and configure appropriate methods for protecting against data security threats, including soft delete, backups, versioning, and immutable storage. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. Azure Storage provides data protection for blob storage and Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 to help you to prepare for scenarios where you need to recover data that has been deleted or overwritten. It's important to think about how to best protect your data before an incident occurs that could compromise it. Recommendations for basic data protection. If you're looking for basic data protection coverage for your storage account and the data that it contains, then Microsoft recommends taking the following steps to begin with. Configure an Azure Resource Manager lock on the storage account to protect the account from deletion or configuration changes. Enable Container Soft Delete for the storage account to recover a deleted container and its contents. Save the state of a blob at regular intervals. For blob storage workloads, enable blob versioning to automatically save the state of your data each time a blob is overwritten. For Azure Data Lake storage workloads, Take manual snapshots to save the state of your data at a particular point in time. Overview of data protection options. The following table summarizes the options available in Azure Storage for common data protection scenarios. Choose the scenarios that are applicable to your situation to learn more about the options available to you. Not all features are available at this time for storage accounts with a hierarchical namespace enabled. Expand table. Scenario data protection option recommendations. Protection benefit available for data lake storage. Prevent a storage account from being deleted or modified. Azure Resource Manager Lock. Lock all of your storage accounts with an Azure Resource Manager lock to prevent deletion of the storage account. Protects the storage account against deletion or configuration changes. Doesn't protect containers or blobs in the account from being deleted or overwritten. Yes, prevent a blob version from being deleted for an interval that you control. Immutability policy on a blob version. Set an immutability policy on an individual blob version to protect business critical documents, for example, in order to meet legal or regulatory compliance requirements. Enable double encryption at the Azure Storage infrastructure level. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. Azure Storage automatically encrypts all data in a storage account at the service level using 256-bit ICE encryption, one of the strongest block ciphers available, and is FIPS 140-2 compliant. Customers who require higher levels of assurance that their data is secure can also enable 256-bit ICE encryption at the Azure Storage infrastructure level for double encryption. Double encryption of Azure Storage data protects against a scenario where one of the encryption algorithms or keys may be compromised. In this scenario, the additional layer of encryption continues to protect your data. Infrastructure encryption can be enabled for the entire storage account, or for an encryption scope within an account. When infrastructure encryption is enabled for a storage account or an encryption scope, data is encrypted twice, once at the service level and once at the infrastructure level, with 2 different encryption algorithms and 2 different keys. Service-level encryption supports the use of either Microsoft Managed Keys or Customer Managed Keys with Azure Key Vault or Key Vault Managed Hardware Security Model, HSM. Infrastructure-level encryption relies on Microsoft Managed Keys and always uses a separate key. To doubly encrypt your data, you must first create a storage account or an encryption scope that is configured for infrastructure encryption. Infrastructure encryption is recommended for scenarios where doubly encrypting data is necessary for compliance requirements. For most other scenarios, Azure Storage Encryption provides a sufficiently powerful encryption algorithm, and there is unlikely to be a benefit to using infrastructure encryption. Create an account with infrastructure encryption enabled. To enable infrastructure encryption for a storage account, you must configure a storage account to use infrastructure encryption at the time that you create the account. Infrastructure encryption cannot be enabled or disabled after the account has been created. The storage account must be of type General Purpose v2 or Premium Block Blob. To use the Azure portal to create a storage account with infrastructure encryption enabled, follow these steps. In the Azure portal, navigate to the Storage Accounts page. Choose the Add button to add a new General Purpose v2 or Premium Block Blob storage account. On the Encryption tab, locate Enable Infrastructure Encryption, and select Enabled. Select Review plus Create to finish creating the storage account. To verify that infrastructure encryption is enabled for a storage account with the Azure portal, follow these steps. Navigate to your storage account in the Azure portal. Under Settings, choose Encryption. Azure Policy provides a built-in policy to require that infrastructure encryption be enabled for a storage account. Create an encryption scope with infrastructure encryption enabled. If infrastructure encryption is enabled for an account, then any encryption scope created on that account automatically uses infrastructure encryption. If infrastructure encryption is not enabled at the account level, then you have the option to enable it for an encryption scope at the time that you create the scope. The infrastructure encryption setting for an encryption scope cannot be changed after the scope is created. Next unit, Knowledge Check. Continue.